Scott, thank you, and thanks to NBR for the invitation to be here. I'm not really going to talk about North Korea after Kim Jong-il. The purpose that I had in my little discussion paper is really to ask the question of how and why have we gotten to where we are today? In effect, let's do history. I don't know exactly how this story ends. There are lots of judgments about the survivability or non-survivability of the regime. We are, by my estimation, to use Nick Eberstadt's label, we are on the fourth cycle now of collapsist thinking about North Korea since the end of the Soviet Union. And although you could say it's a pedantic observation to say that, well, gee, it hasn't collapsed to this point, and you can ask the relevant consideration of whether circumstances might potentially be different. I thought it might be useful for our background and to understand where we are with respect to nuclear weapons, just to look back a bit, if we could, and then maybe I will turn to Dr. Lee to look ahead. The story of trying to prevent or inhibit North Korea's nuclear weapons development is a long and unhappy one, and a very unsuccessful one, demonstrably, since, as we know, there is a long record of negotiated agreements that, as I suggest in my paper, have come to naught. There are many reasons for this, and I'm not here to assess a blame game. It is simply to highlight that there's a rather large gap between the insistence on the part of the DPRK that it is interested in the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and the reality that we face today. And the conclusion I draw, being a kind of a bottom-up sort of guy, is it is the considered judgment of the leadership of North Korea that they feel better about their circumstances by the possession of nuclear weapons than being without them. Now, the general tendency in looking for why this is so is to look at the United States as a factor in this equation. And I've gotten the privilege to know in recent years a man named Hans Moretzky. I don't know that very many of you in the room would be familiar with Ambassador Moretzky. Hans was the last ambassador of the German Democratic Republic to the DPRK. He spent many, many hours with Kim Il-sung. Fewer hours with, he really didn't know the son. But when I was first working on this whole project and giving him some of my learned policy assessments of denuclearization strategies, he looked at me and he said, "You Americans always think it's all about you. It's not." And that has affected me very, very much. Let's remember this is the Korean Peninsula, that there has been a struggle over, if you will, Korean national identity that has emanated in various forms now, some would say certainly since the late 1800s. It is certainly personified very, very much by the history of these very, very divergent systems that we have been dealing with now lo these many years. So in a way, even though we can point to the formal justifications of the program as put out by North Korea, that the question is how we look at both history as it is remembered by the North Koreans and remembered by us, and then ask about the feasibility or viability of the different strategies that we approach here. The first time that a senior American official met with a senior North Korean counterpart was in January of 1992, when the late Deputy Secretary of State Arnie Cantor met in New York with Kim Jong-il, who was head of the party's international department. That was the first introduction that we had, I think, despite having, of course, fought a war in Korea, but to a world as seen by Pyongyang. And I remember shortly after that, I had occasion to talk to Arnie, whom I had known for a long time, and, I think he said that the North Koreans had requested this meeting. It seemed like a good idea, but he was a bit befuddled by it all because it's a totally different frame of reference. Nevertheless, he met with them. The problem here is, it seems to me, is that we were entering this story decades late. As Scott and I were just talking about, I'm in the very final stages of a book that has been a huge preoccupation of mine, much of which is about history, because there is a way to construct this history in the sense that as Americans bemoan how difficult North Korea is, how problematic it is to get them to do this, do that, how they manipulate, cajole, deceive, and so forth, we're newcomers to this game. Talk to Russians, talk to Chinese. If Leonid Brezhnev were here today, we might ask him about when, after the North Koreans seized the Pueblo in 1968, Brezhnev gives a speech, and Brezhnev, first of all, demands that Kim Il-sung comes to Moscow. He refuses to go. He sends his defense minister instead to get read the Riot Act, one assumes, or whatever the version of the Riot Act might be. And Brezhnev gives a speech where he said, North Korea's conduct alarms me. That's his words, not mine. And what I'm saying is all of this history precedes the American preoccupation with these issues that we have seen over the last 20 years. Now, let's look at the debate, such as it is, about this question. As I see it, there are two very basic strategies that Americans put forward when it comes to North Korea and their nuclear weapons capability. One is more, if you will, a demand-side argument. The other is more of a supply-side argument. The demand-side argument says that North Korea, having lost its allies at the end of the Cold War, it confronts a security deficit. Therefore, it is in search of arrangements that can somehow enable it to find its way in the world. That the best way to approach it, therefore, from the United States point of view, would be an incentive-based strategy. Not a problem. An incentive-based strategy that, in effect, would over time diminish the value that the North Korean leadership attaches to nuclear weapons and might even ultimately forego them. So incentives-based assumes a whole range of issues of validation, compensation, assistance of one kind or another, assurance that you can provide, and so forth, and including, of course, the history of the agreed framework and efforts to help them build alternative nuclear capabilities. By contrast, the other side is more of a constraint and a prevention-based argument that says that, well, they do possess them. We don't know what the conditions are under which they would give them up, but all you can do is constrict, contain, defend, impede, and so forth. No more Mr. Nice Guy, if you will. So these are these two interpretations, which I would characterize as if-only interpretations. The incentive-based argument says, look, if you didn't let the hawks get inserted into all of this, and if you didn't listen to your allies in South Korea, if you didn't listen to the voices in the Congress, we could have gotten there. We could have gotten there. Alternatively, those who want to constrain say, except for the fact that you've got all these diplomats involved and all these others who are just in there just to sort of muck up the purity of our strategy, we could have gotten across the finish line. I beg to differ with both. It seems to me we need to look at it most fundamentally at self-conceptions that have been practiced by the North Korean leadership, beginning, of course, with Kim Il-sung, who was in many, many ways a remarkable man. I don't mean that necessarily as praise, but he was a remarkable man. And his not so remarkable son, and that if we can begin less with our grand conceptions and more the underlying basis of this system and of how its leaders conceptualize their long-term goals and needs and how those perhaps have changed over time, I think we could be in a better situation to understand this very, very problematic history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for keeping